Hi, everybody, and welcome to another webinar. I am inviting Scott to share the stage with me right now, so he will be appearing any second now. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Jessica McLeese. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Hi, Scott.
Hi.
And a certified sex therapist. And I have with me today Scott Means, author of The Path to Intimacy. And we're going to be chit-chatting today just about marriage in general and really some ideas from Scott's book. So Scott, welcome. Tell us a little about yourself.
So hi. Welcome everybody. Glad you joined us. My name's Scott Means, as you said. I'm a marriage blogger and have been for about 8 years now. So I've been writing on marriage longer than that. And I have, in addition to my website, I have just, as you mentioned, just published my first book, which is pretty exciting. And my wife and I together have been teaching marriage classes in a curriculum that we developed together for about the same amount of time. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
Yay, how exciting. Well, welcome again. I'm going to be going back and forth between screens. So for those of you that haven't seen one of the webinars yet, I ask everybody to send me all this information regarding what it is that they talk about and what they really enjoy. But Scott, you just wrote an article that I really loved, and you called yourself a mega mysterian, if I'm saying it correctly. Yeah. Can you tell us a little about that?
Okay, so yeah, it's a phrase that I coined because I don't really like a lot of what I hear in the disagreements between sort of the two schools of thought in marriage and what the Bible says about it. One is I call it the complementarian theory, and that is that husbands and wives are of equal value, but they differ in their quote unquote roles in marriage. And then there's the egalitarian school of thought, and briefly it kind of means more of a marriage as equals, and that there are no prescribed roles for husbands and wives that need to be different. So that's kind of a very simple way to describe it. So mega mysterian is a phrase that I coined, at least I think I did, where if you read in Ephesians the chapter on marriage in Ephesians 5, Paul says, he quotes, first of all, he starts off by quoting the verses from Genesis 2, where it says a man and wife will become one flesh. So, and then he says, right after that, he says, and this is a mega mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. So he kind of turns the whole chapter where he's been talking about attitudes of husbands and wives in marriage on its head when he says, actually, it works the same as your relationship with Christ. That husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, and that wives are to take the same attitude as they have toward Jesus in their support and surrender to their husbands. So to me, Ephesians 5 really isn't talking about roles, even though that's kind of how the phrase gets coined a lot. It's really talking about attitudes of the heart, and for husbands and wives, and how they should view their marriage, not in terms of who does what as in functional, but in terms of how husbands and wives should love each other. Yeah. For wives, they most typically have a very high need to be cherished, to be loved, to be cared for, to be shown affection by their husbands. And for men, there's a very high need typically for things like their wives to show support and respect. And that's a well-known kind of differentiator between husbands and wives. Well, it turns out that this mega mystery that Paul is describing in Ephesians 5 is just exactly that. It's a mystery, but the truth is it's a mystery that we'll never fully understand, but we should spend our lives pursuing as husbands and wives. How does Christ treat the church, and how does the church relate to Jesus? So.
Yeah, that's good. And I wrote down a couple of things while you were talking, but talking about it being more a heart issue, and that's actually what we're working on when we look at Ephesians and we look at how marriage should behave, or how we should be in marriage. What's so interesting is our heart affects our behaviors. So Scripture even tells us, like, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so
Right.
whatever's going on inside of us, that's what's coming out. Well, it certainly affects our behaviors as well, because if I'm
Absolutely.
doing everything I can to respect my husband because of a heart issue, because I love him and I'm trying to be a good wife, then I naturally am going to be kinder to him. I'm going to be more respectful. I'm going to make sure not to name call or say something silly
Right.
out in public that embarrasses him. And I think that's just such a great point to remember, that it is a heart issue more than anything. And then those roles kind of naturally develop as we live out that heart issue.
That's good. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And then you talked about the love versus respect also. What I think is so interesting about that is I work with couples often, and when we start talking love and respect, I find that a lot of times women really don't know how to respect their husbands, that it just doesn't translate well. And men a lot of times don't know how to love their wives well. Like it's like we're speaking a different language and not understanding one another.
Yeah, if you read anything by Emerson Eggerichs, he talks about the love and respect thing, and how I think he calls them different colored glasses. We see, men and women see differently, can see the same issue or the same disagreement, and come away with two completely different perspectives. So it's really true. And for the thing that is often true is we try to love our spouse, right, in the way we want to be loved. Like if I were to do that, I would be like focusing on respect for my wife. But if that's not a high need for her, that's going to be a fail, right? In terms of showing her love. Same for the other way around. If she's going to love me as she wants to be loved, that may not work well for me, because my love needs are very different from hers. So we default to kind of the wrong behavior unless we are really aware of this love respect thing that you were just talking about, and being really intentional about it to make sure that we love our spouse in a way that says I love you to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always tell people the best way to do that is to have a conversation and ask your spouse, how do you most feel loved? What do you do to feel, or what makes you feel loved, so that you can tell your spouse, and that way they can try to do some of those behaviors and make sure that they're loving you well.
Yeah.
I'm getting a tiny bit of feedback. I think if you turn your volume down just a tiny bit, that'll help. Hopefully you can still hear me if you do that.
Yeah,
I don't know if anyone else in the audience is doing that. Is there a way to view this on the iOS, iPad, or iPhone? Yes, you should be able to view it from the web link that was given to you. So anyone that's trying to view on iOS, iPad, or iPhone, yes, the link should work just as well. And I'm just putting that in the chat box in case someone can't hear me.
Hey, is this volume working better, or?
That sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much better. That's much better. So you wrote this book, The Path to Intimacy,
Yes.
and I would love to hear a little bit more about it. Now I did get already an outline of it. You sent me that as we were talking about doing a webinar together. And guys, for anyone listening, I was just blown away, because I'm looking at all the topics. I'm like, yes, 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 amen, amen, amen. And I'm just so excited to have you writing on those topics, because absolutely those are things that I'm teaching constantly to couples and teaching people. But I'd love to hear kind of this umbrella view of how you would explain it to anyone listening, what they're going to get from the book.
Yeah. So what I tell people is that intimacy is a hardwired human need, this need for connection. And I guess I should say, first, when I'm talking about intimacy, I'm not just using that word as a euphemism for sexual intimacy. I'm actually talking about that close connection in every dimension of your marriage. So yes, it includes sexual intimacy, and that's an important component, but it also includes emotional, financial, spiritual. So it's the whole package. Intimacy and connection is the whole package. So what I say is that the Lord has hardwired us as humans with the need for intimacy and connection. And a lot of couples that I've done a lot of surveys over my years of blogging, and almost every time, regardless of number of years of marriage, or if they have kids or not, or just married or married 30 years, or first marriage, second marriage, the answer always comes back. The most important thing for people, the most important desire for couples is to have more intimacy in the relationship. And maybe men and women might quite mean sort of slightly different things by that. But the bottom line is couples really really desire intimacy and connection in their relationship. And so that's why I say intimacy is really the most sought after and the most important component in marriage. It's really what I call the goal of every marriage should be that intimate connection. So that's really what the book is, kind of a roadmap of ways to look at your marriage quite differently, and things that you can do practically to foster that intimate connection in the whole of your marriage.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you that intimacy is what people are looking for, even if they sometimes don't know the words for it. So they may not use the word intimacy because, again, a lot of times people do think that that's sexually related, even though we know that it goes so much more than just of a sexual nature. In fact, even people seeing this registration page probably thought, okay, we're going to talk about sex again, when really there's
we can do that. We can do that. Yeah.
But there's definitely more to intimacy than just the physical connection or the sexual connection, because really there's physical connection outside of sex as well, like the handhold, hugs, and the light touches. All of that is also a physical connection, but not sex. And I think people get really confused sometimes by that. And so they'll say things like, well, we're really good roommates, but we don't feel connected anymore. Or I love them, but I don't like them. And really that's all language of I need that connection. Or I love them, but I'm not in love anymore.
Right.
And so it's that constant, I need more than what I have now. Yeah. And maybe people just don't quite have the words for it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And people describe it in different ways, like you said, closeness or a connection, or really, kind of that emotional feeling, or maybe it's a sexual connection. So yeah.
Yeah. It looks like we're having quite a few people that are having trouble connecting with the video or the audio on our iPhone. That's such a pain. I'm just going to add in the chat box real quick. There will be a replay. And so if you're not able to connect, I will get customer service to work on this and make sure that your replay sounds good. I can't do a lot to fix it right now, because if I try to shut this off, it's going to actually, and maybe Chelsea, actually, if you can leave that message for me, because my intern's hanging out doing that. But there will be a replay, so it should be able to catch up after that. Unfortunately, I can't shut this down, because if I do, everybody loses connection. So the people that can hear it right now online would be kicked off. So I can't really do that. But you will get a replay, and the replay has never been an issue, and the customer support has been fantastic with this webinar program. So they'll get it working. Incompatible browser, that's so strange. Safari should work, Firefox, and Chrome. So those are the ones that work. That's such a pain. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay, well, I'm getting a little distracted by that now. Scott, you mentioned financial intimacy. I think that's such an important topic, because I find that there's a lot of people who don't connect well around their finances. If you're a Dave Ramsey fan, he's got the free spirit and the nerd and the saver and the spender. And so it can be really tough to get that financial intimacy. But you're giving tips. What are some of the tips you give people around that area?
Yeah, so financial intimacy, a lot of people don't think about finances and intimacy in the same sentence. But what I mean by that is really being united in your finances and having full disclosure, no hidden spending, having agreed upon and having conversations about money where there's no judgment, and there's a willingness to be vulnerable and talk about fears, for example, over money, or hopes, wishes, dreams, plans for the future, and to be able to have those conversations openly and candidly, and to kind of come around on the same side of the table. And rather than being against each other in the financial area, one against the other, it's the two of you kind of on the same side of the table, working together on your finances and your financial situation. Because we know that, money is a big source of stress for a lot of couples and a lot of marriages. It causes a lot of disconnect. And so having those conversations and being very open about it is the most important thing to financial intimacy, in my thinking.
Yeah, and really those conversations are important for every part of intimacy, because even when we're talking about the physical side or sexual intimacy, if couples can't talk about those things, then they're not going to be able to experience intimacy. and their sex lives either, because it really does, all of intimacy starts with that healthy communication and being willing to be open and vulnerable with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with the topic, the title of the seminar, you talked about being naked without shame.
Mm-hmm.
Really important concept around intimacy. In fact, to me, kind of that phrase, naked without shame, defines intimacy in my mind. And where that comes from is that same Genesis 2 scripture that you hear read at a lot of weddings. A woman shall leave her father and mother and cling to her husband, and the two shall become one flesh. You hear that read all the time at weddings.
Mm-hmm.
Leave off the next verse, which I think is even more important. And it says, the man and the wife were naked and they felt no shame. And to me, that is the very definition of the pre-fall condition of marriage. The actual ideal condition of marriage is to be completely open and vulnerable with each other on every dimension. So if it's money, it's about money. If it's about emotional intimacy, about being completely known. Mm-hmm. It's intimacy is being completely known, but also on the other side is being totally loved. Yeah. Who you are and accepted. And those two pieces together bring intimacy to its pinnacle. Being completely known and fully loved. That is my very definition of intimacy. So that's really what the naked without shame thing comes in. And we can talk about shame if you'd like.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a big issue for a lot of people. The whole shame part that comes from past relationships, and even within the marriage, sometimes just shame from hurts they've caused one another, or even evils and sins that have been done against them that can cause a lot of shame.
Absolutely, absolutely. So shame, to me, shame and intimacy cannot coexist. And so if there's shame, if one person or the other feels a great deal of shame, what that causes them to do is shut down and hide. You go back to that story of the garden with Adam and Eve. What they do when they had screwed up and felt shame, they sewed together fig leaves and came looking for them. They were hiding. Shame causes us to hide from each other, and it blocks intimacy. So what's the antidote for shame? Grace. Grace is probably one of the most important things in marriage. That really, I say grace is an invitation to intimacy. So if my wife feels shame over something, or let's say I have screwed up and hurt her feelings, and I know I have, and I feel badly about it. If she turns toward me and extends grace to me, knowing that it wasn't my intention, it wasn't my heart, then suddenly that connection gets restored. Yeah. If she goes into blame or tries to use shame to manipulate me, then I'm going to go the opposite direction. So that idea that shame blocks intimacy and that grace is the thing that restores intimacy is very important.
Yeah, I love that. And you're right. The shame and the intimacy can't coexist. I think that's a really great quote. I'm actually gonna add that to the reply emails, because that's so important. So you're right. If we're living in shame, we can't have that intimacy, and it takes that vulnerability and that willingness to say, "Here I am, scars and all," and love me. And you're right. And we all so much desire that, to know that we're loved even in the midst of our imperfections.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the reason I can understand that grace equation is because that's how my relationship with Jesus works. It's His grace toward me. The Bible says it's His kindness that leads us to change the way we think. His grace toward me is what restores intimacy with God. And if grace wasn't there, we would always be having our fig leaves out, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. And I love how you say it's, excuse me, how you say it's what points us to God. So Christ's grace points us to God. And I think so often in marriage, Paul talks about that divine mystery now. He's talking about marriage, and he's talking about God, and he's talking about our relationship with Him. But it's interesting that when we show one another grace, we're also able to show one another Christ. So in those moments, we can love you beyond the places where you've hurt me, and I can offer you forgiveness, and I can restore a relationship. It's exactly like Christ does for us. So the beautiful thing about marriage, or at least one of the beautiful things about marriage, is it constantly puts us in this place where we can receive grace and understand grace a little more fully, which we have to do to really be able to take joy in our salvation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, marriage is cool, right?
It is. It's very awesome.
Marriage is cool. I'm going to look at your sheet here. So one of the things that you want to talk about is how society lies to us and tells us that guys don't want intimacy. And also, if my spouse isn't on board, it's hopeless. And you're definitely right. I've heard those lies come through in couples I work with. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you handle some of that, and maybe some teaching you give for people that believe those lies?
Yeah. So, so in the book, I have five lies about intimacy, and you're right. I think the first one I mentioned is that guys don't do intimacy, and I think the problem there is a lot of times wives try to get their husbands to do intimacy the way they do it. Yeah. And maybe that's really not a guy's comfort zone. I think guys do intimacy, they just do it differently than women do. And if you think about, if you've seen guys hanging out at a party versus girls hanging out at a party, and the way they connect, right? It's two very different paradigms. Women are typically talking more, using more words. They're talking more about relationships and emotions. Guys are talking about facts. They're talking about data, right? So it's when guys get vulnerable, they may not get vulnerable with emotions. They may get vulnerable with facts, data, information, things that are important to them. And then wives somehow miss the fact that, hey, this is actually vulnerability. It just doesn't look the way I do vulnerability. So it's, that lie. The truth to counter the lie is that guys do vulnerability. They just do it differently than girls do. I mean, do it differently than girls do.
That's such a good point, because I think that I see that often in couples that I counsel, where the man is very fact-based and it drives the woman nuts. She's like, how come you're not talking about us? And he's like, I don't know what you mean. Everything I've said has to do with us. So you're right. Couples really misunderstand each other in those areas. And then women are so highly relational that everything feels like relationships. Right. So as a wife, if I ask my husband to do the dishes and he's like, yeah, I'll do them, but it takes him 3 hours, in my head I'm like, well, wait, why didn't you love me enough to do them when I asked? Yeah. When really that's silly, right? It's not a big deal, but we get so wrapped up sometimes in, as women, thinking, well, this is what it looks like to be loved well, and if you're not doing that, then somehow we're not meshing. But the way you're saying it is really interesting, because it means shifting that focus a little and saying that when you share the facts, or when you talk about what maybe women see as thoughts instead of feelings, that actually there's probably a lot of feeling underneath that we just have to kind of maybe broaden the way that we see things.
Maybe ask some more pointed questions. If you want to get to the emotional part, maybe you need to probe a little bit, ask the questions a little bit differently, and give him time to kind of dig beneath the data and find that emotion that's attached. 'Cause I know for myself, I'm a little bit that way. I'm a facts guy. I'm an engineer by training, and so data is really important to me. But my wife is, very much the opposite in terms of personality. So we have to kind of understand that we come at things differently, and that's okay.
Yeah, it is okay. It's a part of that intimacy, right? Getting to know one another and being okay with those differences, and still aiming to do everything you can to know your spouse, even though there's that difficulty because you're not 100% alike.
Right.
Which is good. Nobody wants to do a relationship with someone just like them, right? That would be boring.
I forgot what your second lie was that you asked me.
The second lie, let me pull it back up here. The second lie was that, if my spouse isn't on board, then it's hopeless. Yeah,
so it's very easy to get discouraged if you are working on your marriage. If I'm working on my marriage and my spouse isn't, it's easy to get discouraged and feel like if she's not willing or he's not willing to do the work, then I'm not going to try, right? And to kind of give up. And the truth is, I can't tell you how many marriage stories I've heard, either from husbands or wives, where one spouse went first. And while there are no guarantees, There are no absolutes, very few, because you're talking about people, and people are very complicated. In so many, in story after story, I've heard where one spouse or the other begins to work on themselves and make changes in themselves, that the other spouse responds in kind.
Yeah.
It's not a week or a day or a month. Maybe it's a year. Sometimes it's a very long time and a slow process. But it is worth it. And to hang in there, to keep working on yourself, to be the best spouse you can be. And eventually, I believe in most cases, you'll see fruit that grows in your marriage relationship, and you'll see your spouse eventually begin to come on board.
Yeah, that's so good. You know, Kim actually talked about that on the webinar last week. She talked about how her husband wasn't ready to recommit to the relationship and to grow in intimacy, but she felt like God was telling her, stay in this marriage and you do what I've called you to do. And so she did, and she, you know, she prayed and she did everything she could to be the best wife possible and worked on her own stuff. And through that, they did end up back together and have a very fulfilling relationship now.
Yeah.
So I 100% agree. And as
I've heard so many stories that went that way. It's actually rare where both suddenly have that aha moment and they both start working together. Somebody has to go first, usually.
Yeah, you're right. Somebody has to take that first step. And what I find in work with couples is a lot of times neither one wants to take that first step. So it's that vulnerability piece, right? If I show you my pain, then you can do something ugly with it. And so it's scary to make that move. And when we get in that place of hiding in the bushes instead of trying to have this relationship with one another or covering ourselves with the fig leaves, then we cannot get that intimacy like you were talking about. Shame and intimacy don't go together. So somebody has to be willing to take the risk. And anytime someone comes and sees me by themselves and they wonder, well, why am I the one that has to take the risk? I'm like, because you're the one here listening.
You're the one I'm talking to, yeah.
Right. If you're on the webinar listening tonight, yes, you are the one, excuse me, you're the one that needs to take the risk because you're the one that's hearing the information. You're the one that gets to have some knowledge of this is what needs to be done in the marriage. And then if we really believe that God works miracles and we really believe that he ordains marriage and we really believe all these things about how good he is to us, then we have to believe that if we're following what he's asked us to, that just naturally a blessing comes after that.
He will be faithful, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
People still have choice, so you know, like I said, there's no absolutes. But the way I describe it, so I say in the book that your marriage is on one of two paths. You're either on the path of intimacy or you're on the path of separation. That there's no status quo. There's no maintaining safe distance. If you're trying to do that, then you're actually drifting apart. You're separating slowly but surely.
Yeah.
And so the way I describe this idea of somebody going first is someone has to reach across the divide. So if you're on the path of separation and neither partner is willing to reach across the divide, there's no one there to get you off the path and back onto the path of intimacy. So someone has to go first. Someone has to reach across the divide and be intentional about doing some of the things I describe in the book about, you know, doing small selfless acts and little kind things to show love in the way that your spouse wants. And to wait for them to, you know, come around, give you what you need before you start giving them what they need, those kind of things.
Yeah. I really like that idea of you're either on the path to intimacy or you're on the path to separation. Is that what you said? Path to intimacy? Yeah, that's a really important point because I think sometimes life gets so busy that we forget how important it is to feed into the relationship daily. So I really like that idea of either you're moving forward or you're moving backwards. There's no such thing as just kind of maintaining this stable position.
Yeah. It's the excellent roommates syndrome, you know, that's in, and even your marriage isn't bad. Maybe you're not fighting a lot, but there's just this distance, and you're living more like roommates than as man and wife, and that's a time to kind of wake up and realize, hey, there's more than this.
Right.
And that's for your marriage, and he has great things in mind for it. So.
Yeah. And that is part of it, is the realization that there can be more and then aiming for that more, because people can get really comfortable with, well, we're not fighting, so I guess it's okay. And they can get really comfortable with that excellent roommate situation.
Right, exactly.
Very dangerous for the relationship, for sure.
It is. My wife and I have been married 35 years, almost 36. And we keep saying it's better than it's ever been. And that's,
great.
In my heart, I think God's heart for every marriage is that your wedding day should be the worst day of your marriage. It's a little bit hard to think of in that light. But the idea is there's always more. There's always there's more intimacy, there's more love, there's more connection, there's more joy, there's more fullness available ahead. So the best is yet to come.
That's awesome. I'm writing down that quote too, because I'm going to use that later when I tell people to watch this, that the wedding day should be the worst day of your marriage.
I didn't actually come up with that. I heard somebody else say it. So
yeah, that's great though. That's great. I'm so sorry, y'all. I've had like a cough for weeks now. I don't know what's going on, but well, I do know it's allergies. I'm fine, y'all. I'm safe, but I can't get rid of it. So my husband and I have been married 8 years. So July makes 9, and we're all excited about the 10-year because we want to take a big vacation. But we joke with people all the time. Well, it's not a joke, really. Like, we tell people all the time that it increases each year, but we'll say we've been married 8 years. 6 of them pretty doggone good, because our first 2 years were really difficult. And I think it's normal to know that it is going to be a little bit more difficult at first and a little tough. And for us, I was older when I got married. I was used to being on my own, so to all of a sudden have to compromise, that was just tragically difficult for me. And so having to learn
adjustment,
it is an adjustment. So having to learn that, but then just from our own baggage from the past too, that we each brought in, and trying to work through that and figure out what it means to actually love one another well, despite what we believe is in the heart, based on interaction. So I think a lot of times couples, when they're struggling, it's because they see their spouse's interactions with them and they believe that it's much more negative than what's really going on there. So getting easily offended or getting angry about things that maybe actually aren't a big deal if you just talk about them a little. Do you find that couples do that too, especially maybe if they're on the path to separation instead of the path to intimacy?
Yeah, so one thing I caution against is assuming the worst. Also attributing motives to people's actions. It's very difficult for me to know what's in my wife's motives in any particular situation, like it is her to see into mine. So I expect the best and think, hey, did they really mean to hurt me in this situation, or was it just is there just something I'm misunderstanding? And in most cases, like you said, if you just talk about it, if you just verbalize it instead of kind of shutting down or getting offended and separating, you'll actually find that, there was a misunderstanding. It's not what they meant. Or if you just bring it to their attention, they're very quick to apologize. So that just being willing to kind of err in a respectful way that you hurt and reconcile, that's really important. In a disagreement situation, I say the goal of every argument should be to maintain connection. To win, not to prove yourself right or prove your spouse wrong, but to maintain connection. So how different would your fights be if the goal was, I want to make sure we maintain connection through this, as opposed to, I want to make sure that, hey, that I'm heard and that my opinion wins the day and that you see the way I see it.
Right.
I saw Danny Silk Instagram post that said, if the goal of a relationship is connection or intimacy, then agreement can't be the goal of argument. So
that's really good, because I think a lot of times that is the aim that people have. They think, well, if we agree, if we can see things my way, or even if I can see your way, then we've actually solved the problem. But sometimes that won't happen. In fact, Gottman says that 69% of our conflict won't ever resolve. So there's always going to be things that couples don't agree on, that they see differently. Personality might be different.
Right.
There's always going to be things that are going to get in the way of that 100% agreement. Right. So it does come down to, like you're saying, looking instead for reconciliation and making sure you maintain that relationship. Yeah, that's really good. So you had mentioned earlier that, or at least I think you did, if I didn't hear you wrong, that you wanted to talk about the sexual intimacy piece as well. Is that what you said a minute ago?
Sure, yeah, I mean, we can talk. That's certainly an important component, right? So when I do surveys on needs, right, what are top needs, typically for men, sexual intimacy and the sexual connection, the sexual relationship, sexual satisfaction comes in either number one or number two in most of the surveys I've done. Respect ranks really high, and then sex is usually right there, right behind it. For women, it's much less likely that sex is like the most important thing in the relationship. For them, typically, that emotional connection or other kinds of needs are much higher. So the important thing to understand is, I think for those wives whose husbands are a higher drive husband, that you're going to have to move toward him in that space. Just like he needs to move toward you in the emotional connection area, you need to move toward him in the sexual connection area, and be willing to be vulnerable and to meet his needs for sexual intimacy. One of the things that I've heard said before is, have a conversation about how long before it becomes difficult for you, and to actually talk about frequency and kind of what their expectations are, and try to find a sort of middle ground, where the husband doesn't feel like he's in constant sexual frustration, or I should say probably the higher drive spouse, because about 20% of wives actually,
sure,
different various statistics, but about 20% of wives actually have a higher drive than their husband. So whoever the higher drive spouse is should vocalize kind of what their expectation is, so that the lower drive spouse can at least try to move in that direction and to try to meet their needs, even if it isn't a high need.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm writing a post on that right now that I'm trying to get published for tomorrow. And so when there's this discrepancies, because really every marriage alive is going to have some kind of little bit of a gap there, but sometimes people have this tiny gap where one's like, hey, once a week is great, and the other's like, well, twice a week really actually would be great, and that's kind of a small gap. And then sometimes really large gap between people, where one will say once or twice a week would be great, and the other's like, I don't know, every other month actually is fine with me, if I have to.
It's a big gap, yeah.
Right. Sometimes there's a really large gap. And so figuring out how to decrease that gap kind of takes work on both ends, because if there is a really large gap, that means that the higher drive spouse, male or female, is going to feel like they're not getting their needs met as often. And the lower drive spouse is going to feel like, well, I'm constantly having to give to you, even though I don't want to. And really, again, it goes back to that heart, right? Because if I have a heart attitude of you have to meet my need or I have to meet your need, it becomes really almost a competition and just a painful place to live. But if we're both sitting in that place of I want to honor you and I want to cherish you and I want to love you well, then that means there might be times a higher drive spouse will say, you know what, because I love you well and I know I can tell you're not into it, that's fine, we'll wait. And there'll be times when the lower drive spouse will be like, I really totally don't feel this at all, but I love you, and so I want to go ahead and try. And they may not verbalize those words, but they still will get in that place of, okay, I'm going to try to just connect with you and make sure that we're doing well, even though this wasn't actually on my mind.
Right. And try to value the connection, even if you don't value the sexual activity. Value the connection, because for a lot of guys, particularly, sexual satisfaction is kind of opens a wide gateway to emotional connection.
Yeah.
And without that, there's this kind of, as Paul Byerly describes it, this kind of background noise of dissatisfaction that is louder than their need for emotional connection. And so by satisfying that sexual need, it actually makes a husband want to have that emotional connection. And then for a lot of wives, of course, it kind of works backwards, right? They feel like without the emotional connection, it's really hard for me to go there. And so husbands need to feed and nourish that emotional connection in their wives to open the pathway to making that sexual connection. So.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because then you come down to, well, who has to go first, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, it is all about sacrifice, right? So just the way that marriage teaches us about what it's like to connect with God, it also teaches us what it's like to be Christ-like. So it's the sacrifice. And I've gotten a lot of negative response when I've talked about, the lower drive spouse can be willing to have sex even if they don't necessarily feel it, because people kind of come against that sometimes and think, well, that's not, you can't make someone have sex. And I'm definitely not saying forced sex. That's never okay.
No.
But a willingness to say, I'm going to give of myself to you is a good thing in marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, we do that all the time in other areas, right? I can guarantee you, like, neither one, me nor my spouse, we never want to clean the house. Like, we don't. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. But we do that for one another because we don't want to live like pigs, right?
Right.
There are times we do that in marriage. There are movies I'll see that he's more into than I am, and there are shows we'll watch that I'm more into than he is, and it's just our personality differences. But I'm not going to be all excited about some of the action movies he likes. Oh, wait, no, it's sci-fi. I'm really not into sci-fi. Don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. But I can say, hey, I'm going to do this just as a way to connect with you.
Right. Here's an example. So my wife is, and she's online listening, so she really loves old movies. Like black and white gets bonus points, right? So, it's not particularly my thing, but this is really, it really feeds something in her, makes her happy. She loves the old kind of worldview and the values that are portrayed, and she's just really big on those. So sometimes I'll sit with her and watch it with her. And at the end, she'll say, did you enjoy that? And I will say, I enjoyed you enjoying it.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. That's real life right there, right? So we love one another well by doing those other things. Jenny has a statement here that's really good saying, don't you think we believe a lie that the lower drive spouse doesn't really need sex? And Jenny, I would say, yes, that's true. I do believe that sometimes people get to the place where they've pushed down the sex drive so much that they don't even feel sexual feelings anymore. In fact, research shows that about 20% of people actually struggle with what's considered in the clinical world a hyposexual disorder, which means they never want sex, never, ever, ever. They don't feel arousal. And so sometimes that happens. And yeah, it's absolutely true that people can push down that desire and push down that drive so much that they don't even realize that there is an attraction there, and they don't even realize that there's a desire to connect. Or they just separate the two. So sometimes past issues can do that. Sometimes hormonal issues can do that. Sometimes mental health issues like depression and anxiety. All of those things can play a role. But when they're happening, people can get to the point where they really don't see sex as a connection point. And sometimes that could be because the couple needs to learn a little bit more about what it means to connect sexually. Because just having sex or having an orgasm is not a sexual connection.
Right.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
the other thing I've heard described is the difference. Recently, I read a really good post about this. The differences in the sexual response cycle of men and women. That if a woman is waiting to be quote unquote in the mood before she is willing to engage in sex, that she's really kind of self-defeating herself, because a lot of women don't feel desire until they're actually within the action of engaging with their partner, whereas men feel that desire, well ahead of time. They just are wired biologically that way typically, and women are more kind of receptive or responsive with their desire, whereas men are more active or, I guess they call it active desire. So that there's a difference in response cycle. So if a wife is just waiting to feel quote unquote in the mood, it may be a long time before that she feels that active desire. But if she's willing to respond positively to her husband's advances, a lot of times that desire will come. I mean, absent obviously other issues like you were talking about. But in the normal case, I guess I'm saying.
Right, you're 100% accurate on that. That's actually part of the post tomorrow too. So you're right; the sexual response cycles are really important to understand. And yes, men are typically the ones to pursue, and women are typically the ones to receive. And that's just how God designed us, and that's fine. We can work within that system if we know it exists.
Right. Just got to know it's there. Right.
Right. And you're absolutely right about women being more receptive. And so research actually shows a couple of things that are interesting. So first of all, women typically feel arousal before they feel desire, which like you said is different for men because it happens so much more quickly for men typically. But women a lot of times will actually need 10 to 15 minutes of foreplay to even be like, hey, this is kind of nice. I think I'm into this, which means being really willing to what's the word I want to say? So maybe being willing to accept those advances from your spouse and being willing to give of yourself to your spouse, because it's not going to be the same if it is for a man.
Yeah, and then on the husband's side, I think it's also really important to take your time.
Yeah.
Slow down, let her catch up with you, give her a chance to feel that desire through, lots of foreplay and kissing and connection and all those things that are so important to fostering desire. But it's not going to happen, like pushing a button. The guys have to realize you really got to invest time and attention in bringing their wives along, because they're, like you said, they're there like that, and it takes a woman typically a lot longer to.
Yeah. Well, and it's good also for the man to understand that, because a lot of times what will happen with couples is the man will ask the wife, approach her, however he does, "Hey, baby, want to have sex?" And the wife will be like, I mean, I guess. And then he's like, "Well, no, never mind. Forget it if you have to think that hard about it." But the truth is, that's just a difference. So if the man can say, "Okay, cool, I'm going to let you think about it. And while you think about it, I'm going to pursue you more," then a lot of times that's all the woman needs to be like, "Okay, you know what? Actually, I do want to do this. I'm not feeling it yet, but I'm willing to try to feel it, and I want to do this." And so if couples can change that dance a little, where they're okay with having maybe a little bit of awkward communication at first, where one's pursuing and the other's not sure, like if they're willing to kind of do that dance together and change it, a lot of times they'll find that they actually can enjoy the sexual connection much more frequently.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Another thing about low desire too, just and this has really been done more so on research for women. So I know sometimes the man has the lower drive, but for women that have the lower desire, what we've found, or what research shows, is that if they'll have sex more often, they actually get to the point where they desire it more often. So the more frequently that they'll try, basically, and try to connect that connection, they typically find that their desire levels actually go up quite a bit.
Yeah, I know that's really true for us. My wife is chiming in on the chat box. So
Cool.
She's listening in. So
is that Jenny?
Yeah, that's Jenny. She's my.
Hey, Jenny. You have a beautiful picture back there, by the way. I love it.
My family, my 3 girls and my wife. So yeah.
It's so nice.
Happy dad, happy husband. So.
That's right. But I do like that comment too about husbands can ask what helps you get in the mood. I think that's so good. And really, husbands and wives can both do that, because as a sex therapist, I work with desire issues quite a bit with couples. And a lot of times there's just misunderstanding. And so they won't know how to reach out to one another in a way that the spouse is going to be receptive. And that's with men and women, because there have been plenty of times where a woman will tell me, "Well, no, I pursued my husband and he turned me down." And the man's like, "What are you talking about? I would never turn down sex." And she says, "Well, this is what I did." And all of a sudden we realize there's this complete disconnect where he had no idea she was pursuing him. And then by the time he realizes it and he's ready to go, she's like, "You know what, never mind, you rejected me." And really that can happen on both sides. Yeah,
I definitely tell couples, pursuit looks very different to men than to women.
Yeah. And from couple to couple, because really.
And women tend to be a lot more subtle. They drop hints, or they, "Oh, let's go upstairs and go to bed," or,
right.
And
like, I'm
much more, I'll say overt, maybe I should say, without being
right. That's true. And what's funny about that is a lot of women really don't like that overt tone. Right. And so I always joke when I'm talking to couples where the man will be like, "So you want to have sex?" And the woman laughs because she's like, "Yeah, that's pretty much how it goes." And most women just find that that's not really that arousing for them.
It doesn't turn their buttons. Yeah.
Right. It's not exciting for them at all. But even so, men and women can learn to speak a different language where the men can ask in a way. Yeah, and you're right. Women can do things like I've known of women to say, "Well, I put my hand on his leg," and the guy's like, "I didn't know that meant sex. I just thought you were putting your hand on me." So we really do have to communicate better and let one another know what it looks like to initiate a sexual encounter.
Yeah. So communication again. Yeah, seems to be a thing.
Yes. It's always like that baseline of what we have to get right is that communication. Which all the gender differences get in the way of that.
They sure do, don't they? God has a sense of humor that way, I guess.
I know. It's funny because my husband and I, the last time we had a big discussion, we afterwards, when we'd reconciled, we were good. I mean, we weren't split or anything, but we felt good again.
Yeah.
Close.
Mm-hmm.
So when we felt to that close place again, we kind of joked about how, well, hey, we're 8 years in, maybe next year we'll have it down. But it's just so common for couples to have issues around communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
I'm reading a comment here. So it's powerful to know that I can choose to be what my husband really dreams of. But this in a situation where I know I'm really loved and understood. Oh, that's so good, right? To know that you can be loved and be what your husband wants, but still be really, know that you're really loved as well. That's good stuff. Let's see, Jessica Fraser. Oh, thanks, Jack. I appreciate that. I look forward to more marriage sexual talk you both do. Oh, thank you, Jack. Thanks so much for being a part of this and chiming in. That's fun for us when people chit chat back and forth with us. I love the communication piece. And what's interesting, Scott, is it's not just gender differences that get in the way, but personality differences.
Personalities, absolutely.
Yeah, and my husband is, I say more of an introvert. I always call myself an introvert, and then people tell me I'm unaware. I really am on the inside, so I can take that criticism. But he's much more of an introvert than I am, and so even that can get in the way for us sometimes because I can go out and hang out with people all day, and he just doesn't do that well. Chelsea says I froze. Am I frozen on your end, Scott?
No, you're good with me.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not frozen anymore. I'm going to ask in the chat box. Am I frozen? Not frozen for me. Okay, so not for everybody. That's good. And now I lost what I said. Okay, so the gender and the personality differences. So
yeah, so I'm off the chart introvert.
Are you?
Actually, this is stretching my comfort zones right now. But my wife is, of course, she's the opposite. She's very extroverted and off the chart kind of extroverted. Also, she's a verbal processor. Like to kind of go away and think about it and assess it. Maybe my analytical nature, I don't know. And then, come back with the answer, maybe in the morning or like, a couple hours later after I've had a chance to kind of start about that. Forget to turn the phone off. So to kind of, go away and process it. So we have to understand our differences in styles and preferences for communications. And sometimes that means me being willing to talk it through, even though that's not really comfortable for me.
Yeah.
Her being willing to give me some space to kind of go away and figure out how do I actually feel about this and how do I really want to express myself. So it's a willingness to be, to push your own comfort zones a little bit for each other.
For sure. And that's so good because you and your spouse sound a lot like me and my spouse. And so kind of same roles there. And he needs that time alone to process sometimes also where I need to talk it out. So it's kind of funny to be in this conversation with you about that. I see, let's see. So Brooke says, is sex talking via text a form of foreplay? Absolutely, Brooke. That works really well for some people, especially for someone who's a lower drive spouse. It can help to have something that's a bit of a reminder for them to think about sex throughout the day, one another. So yeah, absolutely. That's a form of foreplay. It's a lot of times called sexting now in popular culture. So certainly okay to do that. You guys have to have your own limits on what that looks like for you. And I would just say be careful of pictures because there's this thing called the cloud that sometimes we don't.
Security. Used to be.
So watch for that. But yeah, sexting is a great form of foreplay. Little letters in one another's lunchbox or whatever you take to work. Leaving things on the door so when you come home you're going to see lingerie on the doorknob or something. All of that stuff is great ways of having foreplay. It doesn't have to be actual touching. Remember, most of that's mind anyways, and getting your thought life there.
Yeah, Jenny made the comment I think earlier. It starts in your head. It's if your head's not there, then it's very difficult to get your body to follow. But
yeah, so true.
With little notes or sexting or
Yeah, I follow a psychiatrist sometimes, his podcast, and he has a webinar where he's like, I'm about to show you all a picture that's not usually shown in public. This is the largest sex organ known to man, and he puts up a picture of the brain, and it's just
absolutely so true.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
It is. So, Jack, will there be more of these discussions? We'll talk about that. We'll see. This is the first one that Scott and I have done. I've done some more webinars. Maybe today we'll convince Scott to do more webinars since he's getting out of the endurance.
Yeah, I think you could probably talk me into it.
Yeah.
Really
We'll
fun.
see how that goes for you. And then Jenny, if you're struggling with drive, there's a fine line between feeling pressure and freezing up. You're so right. Absolutely true. So I've found that to be the case often for people when they struggle with low drive. It's hard to get in that place where they say, well, I'm going to be comfortable because I'm pursuing. You're right. There's a balance there that we got to figure out. What helps a lot of times for the low drive spouse is to have kind of a sex date where it's scheduled. And I know that's weird for people, but we schedule the things that are most important to us. And it doesn't mean that if you have put sex on the calendar that you have to. So if someone's seriously sick, not just you don't feel like it, but if someone's sick, or if something has come up with the kids, or if there's a family emergency, like it's understandable that that may have to change. But for most people that are lower drive, it can help to have that on the calendar. So then they know in those other moments, it's still okay to have some kind of physical touch without feeling like there's going to be this pressure where my spouse thinks that I want to have sex when I don't.
Right. Yeah, that is a real danger, is that for low drive wives, shun physical touch because or any indication of affection, because then they're going to get pressured into having sex. So they tend to kind of withdraw a little bit. And that actually, I tell my wife, I would much rather you flirt with me like crazy all day and then us not follow through than for you to be distant and not, not show me that kind of affection. That's just how, at least it is for me. I don't know if it's the same for most husbands.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And what's crazy is for the low drive person, if you quit having that physical affection, that drive is actually going to go down even more because we need some of that oxytocin release and that feeling of connection to actually want to have sex.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't want to lose those behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brooke's asking, what are some things to repair sexual intimacy after an affair? So there's a really great book that I would recommend. It's called Torn Asunder, and it's by Dave Carter. He also has a workbook that goes along with it. A lot of times it's going to take deeper than that, though. It's going to take some counseling and some help from a professional. So definitely don't underestimate that help. But Torn Asunder is a fantastic workbook that you guys can use together. You can both sit down, go through the book and the workbook, and it'll have you go through several exercises to help you understand how the relationship got to a place where an affair occurred, and then also show you how to really protect your relationship from that happening again. And then kind of that final step is really bringing intimacy back into your relationship. What we've been talking about tonight, not just sex, but this whole picture of intimacy and connecting with one another in a way where you're really providing a safety for your marriage. Really, we're all blind and dumb if we think that we can't have an affair in our relationship too. I mean, we're all sinners and we can all be tempted and we can all fall into that place. And so all of us should be putting things into our relationship to make sure that we're safe and that there's boundaries and that we're loving one another well. Kind of like you said, Scott, you're either on the path to intimacy or the path to separation.
Right. Very few couples are on the path of intimacy will find themselves in an affair.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we're getting kind of close to time here. We have just a couple of minutes. If any of you guys have another question, now is the time to ask. And Scott, for you, I'm just so appreciative of